I've been stuck thinking about Season 1 of True Detective for more than a decade. Part of it is the incredible on-location cinematography, which I covered pretty extensively in my previous video titled The Scene That Changed Television Forever. The other part is the depth there was, both in story and character development. I find myself always circling back to that first season just to spend more time in that world. Something deep within me is still drawn to the strangeness of it after all these years. But today I wanted to get deep into the trenches with just one of the characters from that season, Detective Rustin Cohle. Then we'll dive into Rust's philosophy, where we'll briefly cover a few fun philosophers and philosophies along the way, all while touching on how each piece funnels back into Rust Cohle's overarching philosophy. There it is. Now, I say briefly because each of the upcoming sections could easily be made into multiple hour-long videos diving into their respective topics. But for the sake of time and all of our sanity, if you're fortunate enough to still have some of that, I'm going to do my best to keep it tight. Because ultimately the theme of the day is Rust Cohle's philosophy. Not this guy's, or this guy's, or this guy's, or even this guy's, and especially not this guy's. After discussing Rust's philosophy a bit, we'll go over how this beloved character even came into existence and where True Detective writer and creator Nick Pizzolatto pulled from to develop such an iconic fella. And then we'll close out with some post-philosophical thoughts and y'all can go on your merry little way. So pour yourself a glass of Jameson.
I don't drink.
Or not. Either way, strap in for the philosophy of Rust Cohle. Meet Rust. Detective Rustin Spencer Cohle, nicknamed the Taxman by his fellow officers. Reason being, while other detectives took notes about an investigation on their little notepads, Rust used a large ledger to jot down any details he might observe into it, giving him the appearance of a taxman who goes door to door, with a book full of debts owed, looking to collect. An appearance that wasn't too far from reality. Rust also had another nickname. He spent some time undercover riding with the biker gang known as the Iron Crusaders. During that time, Rust had the nickname Crash, which, according to a semi-reliable online source, his full nickname was actually Car Crash. Regardless, Crash was the name that stuck, due to his tolerance for risk-taking and an equally high capacity for violence and getting his hands dirty. Both nicknames do a great job of summarizing Rust. A bit of yin and yang, if you will. He has a willingness to attack unbothered by the potential consequences to himself, making the name Crash suitable, regardless of whether he's undercover or not. But he rarely does so without making sure his actions serve a purpose. Something he's seemingly always aware of thanks to his fine note-taking. Because
I mean, you never know what the thing's gonna be, do you?
Rust's obsession over a case and attention to detail makes his Taxman nickname equally fitting. Rust is patient and he is focused, while not afraid to risk his well-being for what he deems righteous and just. The Rust we meet has a strong moral compass, or in the words of the late Steve Harvey,
his moral barometer,
and seems to sustain it throughout, regardless of the ups and downs he has between 1995 and 2012, the years we saw Rust on screen. But was he always like this? What happened before our introduction to Rust in 95? Rust was born November 6, 1964 in South Texas. His parents divorced sometime later and his father, Travis Cohle, took young Rust up to Alaska, where he spent most of his childhood. Rust's dad was a survivalist and a Vietnam veteran. Not much is mentioned regarding Rust's dad, but as Rust got older, he claimed to grow tired of the cold climate and conditions of Alaska, and
I headed back to South Texas because all I could remember was at least it never got cold.
something Rust's father, Travis, seemingly held against him, considering it a lack of loyalty for leaving Papa Cohle behind.
My old man always made like I let him down that way.
Upon returning to Texas, young Rust found himself working as a detective in the robbery squad for the Houston Police Department. He also snagged himself a wife named Claire, and the two of them had a daughter named Sophia. The good times of yesteryear were cut short sometime in the mid to late 80s. Sophia was lost to a car accident when she was only 2 years old. Rust and Claire's marriage couldn't survive the loss of their child, and not long after, the two divorced. Moving forward, there will be very little brightness about Rust's character or his philosophy. In fact, I would argue that the only big bright part about Rust's timeline was in fact the moments he had with Claire and his daughter Sophia. Prior to their existence in his life, the small bits that we get about Rust's past involve a pretty dark childhood and a potentially delusional, semi-paranoid, survivalist father as the primary mentor. There's a strong probability Rust has always been headed the direction he ended up, but the moments with his wife and child provided a light-hearted detour. After the loss of his daughter, followed by the divorce of his wife, Rust no longer had a reason to remain tethered to reality. He immediately switches from the robbery unit to narcotics in his department. He also dramatically ramps up his drinking and starts using a wide variety of drugs. My man. One day, while working narcotics, Rust comes across a tweaker injecting meth into his infant daughter and snaps, killing the tweaker. As a result, he's given a choice: prison time or go deep undercover as a narcotics detective in a high-intensity drug trafficking area. Rust goes on to do 4 years undercover, when the standard is generally never more than 11 months. The only reason his 4-year stint undercover ended was because of a shootout gone wrong that happened when he was riding his crash at the Iron Crusaders. The shootout resulted in the death of 3 cartel members and Rust ending up with multiple gunshot wounds. With the Iron Crusaders assuming he was dead, he was removed from undercover and given the opportunity to retire with a full pension. Instead, Rust refused and requested being transferred to a homicide unit, landing him in the state of Louisiana. The benefit of being undercover for Rust was that he was working 24/7. Work-life balance was a non-issue for Rust, as he was trying to avoid the whole life thing. No longer undercover, Rust has no life beyond his work. So now, being a homicide detective for the state of Louisiana is his only focus. With an apartment that has next to nothing in it beyond a bed on the floor, a tiny mirror, books on criminology, and a cross so that he can
Contemplate the moment in the garden, the idea of allowing your own crucifixion.
Rust also has what's called synesthesia and deals with hallucinogenic persisting perception disorder, or HPPD, which have the potential to cause extremely unique side effects when occurring simultaneously. There are 2 known types of synesthesia: projective synesthesia, the more widely understood version of the two, which leads to seeing colors, forms, or shapes when stimulated, and the other is associative synesthesia, which leads to feeling a very strong and involuntary connection between the stimulus and the sense that it triggers. I would argue that Rustcohle deals with both. This coupled with HPPD, and Rust is in for a good old-fashioned psychedelically unique time. I think his synesthesia and HPPD are worth mentioning because while they aren't philosophical traits in nature, I think it adds to the overall picture of Rustcohle's philosophy, even beyond his unique life experience. In layman's terms, if he's seeing shit different and hearing shit different, he'd probably be philosophing different too. Rust also tends to go back and forth on the whole sobriety thing, something that appears to be dependent upon whether he's in a stage of taxingly focused self-control or a state of crash out and letting everything loose. Okay, now that we're all caught up to 1995 and beyond, after a brief overview of who our boy Rusty Rust is, let's move on to the meat and potatoes. Rust's philosophy.
I'd consider myself a realist, all right, but in philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist.
So Rust self-identifies as a pessimist. Let's take a look at what that means. First, it's important to make a distinction between a pessimistic attitude and philosophical pessimism. A person with a pessimistic attitude generally views life as an overall bad time, defined as a tendency to see the worst aspect of things or believe that the worst will happen, a lack of hope or confidence in the future. Real glass half empty types, Debbie Downers if you will. Pessimism as an attitude has been known to parallel the study of depression, and historically it's been associated with melancholy or melancholia, not to be confused with the great Lars von Trier film. Nope, not that one. Oh god, not that one either. There we go, that's the one. But today, I'm not here to talk to you about melancholia or pessimism as an attitude. Instead, I want to focus on philosophical pessimism. Small warning, anytime I mention pessimism moving forward, I'll be referring to philosophical pessimism. As we heard before, Rust describes himself in philosophical terms as being a pessimist. So what does that mean?
It means I'm bad at parties.
Alright, I guess that covers it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Nah, just kidding. I've got a little more sweet philosophical nectar for you. But first, let's set a baseline. I'm going to give an oversimplified definition for the philosophy of pessimism, just so there's something to go back to as we get deeper into the weeds of this thing. If you or I start to get disoriented or confused, returning to this can be a useful tool. Philosophical pessimism argues that life and existence are hopeless, coupled with a vague, general opinion that pain and evil predominate in the world. Suffering outweighs pleasure, happiness is fleeting, and existence is meaningless. Okay, there you go. Like I said, simple. Think of this as an anchor. If you're simple-minded like me, then it helps to have a simple spot to go back to when getting bamboozled by
$10 words.
and dense text that's sometimes tough to deal with in philosophy. That said, know that this isn't a hard definition, and there's a wide variety of pessimistic philosophers that would argue for or against every word in that definition I just gave you. Oh, and there's no such thing as anchors in philosophy. They're meaningless. All right, you feeling better? You ready? Get your helmet on, because you'll need it. I know I'll be wearing mine, and this next part will be the girthiest section of the video, so buckle up. All right, enough background dribble. Let's get into it. Early pessimism. Slave, listen to me. Here I am, master. Here I am. What then is good? To have my neck and yours broken, or to be thrown into the river? Is that good? Who is so tall as to ascend to heaven? Who is so broad as to encompass the entire world? O slave, I will kill you and send you first. Yes, but master would certainly not survive me for 3 days. Buddhism. What if I told you it was a few filthy religions that were responsible for providing the world with the initial bump in pessimism? What are some of the religions that first come to mind? I'm betting most folks' first thought is not Buddhism. I know it wasn't for me. I kind of assumed the whole enlightenment thing equated to bliss. But as it turns out, in ancient times, you had the Buddha cruising around telling everyone life is suffering. Out here talking about dukkha, also known as suffering, pain, and unease. This so-called suffering is caused by desire, and liberation or nirvana means freedom from desire, freedom from rebirth, and freedom from suffering. So what does this mean? That pessimism is needed to achieve enlightenment? For context, this was happening around the 6th and 5th century BC, making the Buddha one of the first to become documented indulging in some pessimism. Reminder that I said BC as opposed to AD. Basically, this was happening a long-ass time ago. But then we've got Judaism and Christianity. The Jews' Ketuvim and the Christians' heavy-handed Old Testament have some pessimism within the Ecclesiastes authored by King Solomon. Really quickly, I want to mention there's been debate amongst scholars on the exact timeline, but King Solomon likely wrote Ecclesiastes somewhere between 450 and 180 BC. In it, he writes of the meaninglessness life has to offer. In the King James Version of the Bible, Ecclesiastes 7:15 says, "All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth in his life in wickedness." For a little clarity, the New International Version says, "In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these, the righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living long in their wickedness." In the King James Version, chapter 1, verse 2 says, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." In the NIV Version, saying, "Meaningless, meaningless," says the teacher, "utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless." You get the picture. For both Christianity and Judaism, the purpose of most of this is to convey that life is meaningless if you're living a life without God. A lifestyle choice Rustcohle tends to look pretty aggressively down upon.
Religion is a language virus that rewrites pathways in the brain, dulls critical thinking.
Next in the ethos of early pessimism, we have what's called Gnosticism. Not to be confused with agnosticism, Gnosticism is similar in that it was a belief system about knowledge, but but opposite in that agnosticism is a belief in the knowledge of no God or elevated reality, and Gnosticism is the knowledge of God, a spiritual knowledge of God, and of all things holy. These guys were heavy hitters, around primarily between 1 to 3 AD, believed themselves to be the only true Christians. Pretty typical of every subsect of Christianity though, eh? But they were considered heretics by most of the Christian churches at the time. Gnostics believed in spiritual growth. They believed that the body was a prison for the soul and that earth was a hell that needed to be escaped. The cosmos being a result of a failed work, and all that exists for us in this world is to suffer and ultimately die. But those that desperately pursue spiritual growth in preparation for an afterlife are amongst the chosen to return to the heavens with whence they came. Those who do not are destined for an undisclosed number of reincarnations, aimlessly wandering this hell on earth. Now
That's a spicy!
early stage pessimism right there, with a little dash of cosmos, but once again, existence is rationalized by the pursuit of God. Seems to be very clutch when you need a reason to not say bon voyage to the whole life thing. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead 15 or so centuries, get us up to speed. I'd love to give you a more detailed outline leading up to our boy Rust, but if I do that, we'll be here for 3 days. I could be persuaded to go a little deeper some other time though, but all I want to do today is to set a solid foundation for where Rust's self-proclaimed philosophy is derived from. Plus, persuasion might not work as everything is in fact meaningless. Though we are skipping ahead, I'm going to mention a few names that deserve acknowledgement when discussing pessimism. A couple, maybe even a few of them, all include some level of elaboration, before popping out on the other side and back into Rust's deep pit of despair he calls life. To kick things off, we have the absolute legend of ancient Greece, Hegesias of Cyrene, who wrote the lighthearted book called Death by Starvation around 290 BC that may or may not have encouraged people to consider that death might be a little more enticing than life, earning him the nickname Death Persuader. Real Thomas Ligotti vibes if you ask me, a fellow we'll be talking about a little later in this video. Then we have Boethius, bringing in the Middle Ages. Pessimism is out of fashion and now considered contradictory by Christianity's whole divine hope thing. Next, we have the Renaissance to early modern era, which included the likes of Michel de Montaigne, Blaise Pascal, Thomas Hobbes, not to be confused with Calvin and Hobbes, and Jonathan Swift, who actually wrote Gulliver's Travels. Now we hit the 18th and early 19th centuries, an era of optimism, but the line of pessimism was held strong against such foolish ignorance with guys like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Giacomo Leopardi. But it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that pessimism finally hit its stride. A German fella named Arthur Schopenhauer put his philosophical pessimism into a well-structured, presentable form, separating it from its religious roots. Ironically, later in life, Schopenhauer would express quite a bit of interest in Buddhism's idea of enlightenment. With heavy influence from Immanuel Kant, old Arthur Schopenhauer would reshape some of Kant's ideas on reality. Kant believed we were never able to access reality because our minds reshape it, altering its appearance. Schopenhauer's unique little spin was that he swapped out reality with will. Reality is a manifestation of will, and if we aren't able to access reality, it's because our filthy, complex minds are getting in the way. Now, I can't go too far down this rabbit hole because it'll lead us too far off the path. I just can't. But I'd recommend doing additional exploring of your own on these guys if you're digging early pessimism. Obviously, after you're done watching this video. Modern pessimism. Human life must be some kind of mistake. The truth of this will be sufficiently obvious if we only remember that man is a compound of needs and necessities hard to satisfy, and that even when they are satisfied, all he obtains is a state of painlessness, where nothing remains to him but abandonment to boredom. This is direct proof that existence has no real value in itself. For what is boredom but the feeling of the emptiness of life? If life, the craving for which is the very essence of our being, were possessed of any positive intrinsic value, there would be no such thing as boredom at all. Mere existence would satisfy us in itself, and we should want for nothing. Arthur Schopenhauer, Studies in Pessimism, the Essays.
I think human consciousness is a tragic misstep in evolution.
Schopenhauer would say stuff like, A pessimist is an optimist in full possession of the facts, and life is a constant process of dying, and life is a constant oscillation between the desire to have and the boredom of possessing. On the surface, it feels pretty grim, and maybe it is, but old Schopenhauer was the first to clarify what a pessimistic philosophy looked like when you stripped away religion and passive commentary. After Schopenhauer, pessimism started popping off, with dudes like Julius Bonson, Philip Mainlander, Edward von Hartmann, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who we'll be touching on more deeply later. But first, let's talk about a fellow named Albert Camus, who wrote an essay titled The Myth of Sisyphus, which used the punishment of the Greek king Sisyphus of endlessly pushing a huge boulder up a steep hill in the afterlife as a metaphor for the human condition, with Camus stating, "The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." In another one of Camus' articles, titled Renaissance, Rebellion, and Death, he wrote, "The idea that a pessimistic philosophy is necessarily one of discouragement is a puerile idea, but one that needs too long a refutation."
What the hell is even that?
You might be asking. What he's saying is only a child would think of pessimism as a philosophy of discouragement, but explaining why it's childish to think that way takes too long to explain over and over again to weak-minded Neanderthals like your mom. Sorry that last part was rude, but it needed to be said. Regardless, Albert Camus coming in with some real solid glass half empty thinking. Does that mean viewing the glass half empty is not necessarily a bad thing? Rust versus pessimism. Alright, so you've been hammered with a lot of the backstory to philosophical pessimism. So let's circle back to Rust. Throughout the show, he's experiencing a lot of back and forths regarding will and how he experiences reality, even beyond his blend of HPPD and synesthesia, often bouncing between drinking and not drinking depending on the circumstances. Drinking when dealing with forced reflection, like the memory of his daughter, or performative, like devolving into Crash, or when confronted with self, like indulging in lust with his partner's wife, or the emptiness within, when he's stripped away from work, like after he left the police force. Meanwhile, not drinking when he's focused and moving with purpose, like when he's active duty and kicks things off on the Dorleng case. As long as he's pushing the boulder up the hill, he seems to be somewhat stable. It's when the boulder rolls its way back down again that Rust tends to lose control. So when we meet Rust in 1995, he's pretty deep into his pessimistic journey, but sometimes walks the line of nihilism, which can be defined as everything is meaningless. Imagine summarizing an entire philosophy in 3 words. Well, I just did. I'd be a little worried about nihilists coming for me, except they ain't.
Believes in nothing.
He believes in nothing, Lebowski, nothing.
So 95 Rust sits pretty firmly in pessimism, but dabbles a bit in feelings of nihilism with things like life is meaningless and by suggesting that our existence is an accident and we shouldn't exist at all. Rust says he tells himself his purpose is to
Bear witness.
but mentions that
The real answer is that it's obviously my programming.
and he lacks the constitution to provide himself with the more permanent solution of non-existence. Or it would be permanent if, when the language is stripped down a bit and we look at Rust's actions, he sits pretty comfortably on his pessimistic throne. 2002 Rust actually seems to have a strong sense of purpose and finds himself more involved in life. He finds himself in a relationship, though he later ends it, and working as a fairly renowned interrogator throughout the local area. But all of this comes crashing down when Rust continues drinking and gives in to worldly urges with his partner Marty's wife. Schopenhauer has another quote that I feel fits well here. "No rose without a thorn, but many a thorn without a rose." Rust had a brief moment with a rose and was quickly thrown back in the thorns, reminding him of the purposelessness of indulging in pleasure. Rust gives in to his perceived nature, quits his job, moves to Alaska, and becomes a fisherman, where he can spend his days drinking and fishing, counting down the clock. Initiate Rust covering himself in a very large nihilistic blanket sequence. Rust remains wrapped in this blanket for 8 or so years. That is until his deeper calling returns. In 2010, when he returns to Louisiana, he's given a purpose again, likely the only purpose that's been keeping him alive. A debt he felt needed repayment. Even though he mentions after the debt is paid, he'll likely be checking out permanently, which would be concerning if When we arrive at Rust in 2012, he's like a hodgepodge of what we've seen before. Still disciplined and focused, extensive notes, meticulous attention to detail, and seemingly photographic memory around every aspect of the case, even 20 years later. Alternatively, Rust is still completely alienated from society more so than ever, and now has leaned into his self-indulgence in respect to his drinking, never without a drink in hand, either in his shed or at the bar he's working at. Yin and yang. Crash and the Taxman. Rust might front with some nihilistic tendencies in how he speaks, but still finds himself more aligned with pessimism. Most of his beliefs throughout align with pessimism's central themes of life is not worth living, the bad prevails over the good, and non-existence is preferable to existence, but still showing up for life, programming or not. Speaking of non-existence being superior to existence, that feeds right into our next philosophy, known as anti-natalism. Procreation is unethical and unjustifiable due to the uncertainties and suffering that coincides with existence. This one is pretty simple. Russ suggests that the
Honorable thing for our species to do is deny our programming, stop reproducing, walk hand in hand into extinction.
basically life sucks and it's just rude to make babies. It's completely unethical to inflict that level of suffering on someone else, especially when they have no choice in the matter. A couple of years ago, there was a woman from New Jersey who joked that she sued her parents for making her and received $5,000 a month for her troubles, aka being alive. Although her troubles with life might have less to do with being alive and more to do with living in New Jersey. Come on, I'm joking. Shout out to you, New Jersey. Thank you so much for The Sopranos and Pauly D. For some background, antinatalism actually ties back to pessimism and was made popular by two pessimists. One, Emile Cioran, was a pretty strong advocate against the whole existing thing, but also was pretty against ending your life, though not for the reason you might suspect. Emile claimed it wasn't worth removing yourself from this life because life and death are equal in meaninglessness, but ending it yourself isn't worth it because you're inevitably doing it too late, suggesting that non-birth is the only reasonable time to slip into non-existence. The other anti-baby making pessimist I want to mention is still alive and semi-well. He goes by the name David Benatar. David Benatar came up with what is now known as Benatar's asymmetry argument for antinatalism, which he introduced in his book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence. In it, he covers the positives and negatives when comparing existence versus non-existence. Here's a little graph for your viewing pleasure. Now, to better understand this, I had to dig up one of my old school books from another lifetime ago, and after flipping through it, I was reminded of how simple-minded I really am, and barely understood this when I was actually taking the class. It also did not seem to provide any assistance in better explaining what you're seeing in this graph, but whatever. Benatar's argument is that the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good. That said, the absence of pain is also good, even if that absence is a result of non-existence. Furthermore, the absence of pleasure is not bad unless there's someone for whom the absence is a deprivation. This argument ties into procreation, because if existence provides both good and bad experiences, pleasure and pain, all the while not coming into existence results in neither pain nor pleasure. The absence of pain is good, the absence of pleasure is not bad, and so the ethical choice leans towards non-procreation. Rust versus antinatalism. Rust's entire existence has revolved primarily around pain, with very rare moments of any pleasure, most of which were stripped away not long after being experienced, resulting in Scenario B looking pretty damn good to a guy like Rust. Hence the underlying antinatalism he seems so fond of. Psst, babe, wake up. This dork is about to try to explain one of the most complicated philosophers of all time in just a few minutes. Babe, it gets worse. He's also going to include how it ties into one of the most beloved characters to ever exist on television. I know, baby, he's cooked. Time is a flat circle. I come again with this sun, with this earth, with this eagle, with this serpent, not to a new life or a better life or a similar life. I come back eternally for this same, self-same life. Thus spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Time is a flat circle.
I said, Nietzsche, shut the fuck up. This is a world where nothing is solved. When someone once told me time is a flat circle.
Who the fuck is
Nche.
you might be asking? Well, that video alone would take a decade to make and 6 days to watch. So instead, I'm going to give you a brief rundown of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical outlook and why Rust associated him with time is a flat circle after that hillbilly wanker said it. But for the sake of context, I'd still like to shed a tiny light on who the fellow was. A little backstory, if you will. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born in Prussia in 1844, a German philosopher who managed to crank out pretty profound bits of work starting at a very early age. He wrote a litany of books and essays like Beyond Good and Evil, which is generally considered the best starting point when reading Nietzsche, The Gay Science, which is extra spooky for religious folks, but not for the reason you'd think. The Gay Science is the book in which Nietzsche famously states God is dead, and he criticizes traditional morality and religion. Nietzsche also wrote The Antichrist. No, not you again. Damn it, Lars. That's the one, in which he introduces the concept of willpower, which viewed power as a driving force to grow and develop, striving for one's fullest potential despite suffering. For a period, Nietzsche's outlook heavily aligned with our boy Schopenhauer, but this book pretty definitively burns that bridge. Schopenhauer was pretty big on compassion as it allowed for shared suffering, leading to a strong
Moral barometer.
Meanwhile, Nietzsche felt compassion was cool but didn't contribute to morality in any way, and actually made you weaker, denying that sweet, succulent will to power. Nietzsche also targets a variety of religions in the Antichrist. Spoiler alert, in case the title didn't give it away already, claiming Christianity makes men soft due to its peaceful nature. He also criticized Buddha, stating that both Christianity and Buddhism are nihilistic in nature. But of the two, quote, Buddhism is 100 times as realistic as Christianity, end quote. Nietzsche believed Buddhism's realism is what made it more palatable to Christianity. Its application to reality using philosophy rather than a God concept, and the struggle with suffering rather than the struggle with sin. Unfortunately, he was plagued by pretty heavy health issues in the last 10 years of his life or so. His health issues grew worse and he struggled with his grasp on the societal standard of reality, which is just a fun way of saying his body gave out and his mind was lost. Friedrich Nietzsche died in the German Empire in 1900 at the age of 55. But like I said, I'm not here to discuss Nietzsche. Instead, we'll be discussing the connection between time is a flat circle, how it aligns with Nietzsche, the evolution of Rusty Cohle with this statement, and what it all means. Nietzsche had a concept he called eternal recurrence. He briefly mentions it in his book The Gay Science, but dives in deep on it in his philosophical fiction novel Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book for all and none. As a work of fiction, the character Zarathustra is grappling with the terror of an eternal return, being stuck in the endless cycle of living the same life
Again. And again. And again.
Zarathustra distracts himself with other things to avoid confronting this reality, distracting himself with things like letting saints know God is dead. And there's a new type of human, a superhuman. You might even call him a Superman, known as the Übermensch. Oddly similar to a young detective Rust who is highly critical of the preacher.
Transference of fear and self-loathing to an authoritarian vessel. He absorbs their dread with his narrative. Because of this, he's effective in proportion to the amount of certainty he can project. Certain linguistic anthropologists think that religion is a language virus that rewrites pathways in the brain, dulls critical thinking.
Rust is also quick to dismiss the mention of time as a flat circle when it's initially offered up. Granted, the messenger delivering the flat circle bit probably isn't the type of dude anyone should be looking to for philosophical insight. But fast forward 15 years later, and Rust is a hardened alcoholic who's been swimming around in darkness and depravity, and now finds himself quoting the same man he dismissed.
When someone once told me time is a flat circle.
Rust versus Nietzsche versus nihilism. There's some debate that surrounds whether Nietzsche was a nihilist or not, which is quite similar to debates I've seen regarding Rust and where he lands philosophically. I don't think either of them are. No matter how much Rust tries to convince us that he wakes up in the morning and shows up for life due to programming and a lack of constitution for driving his car off a cliff, he is still willing to go to any lengths to find the truth and serve up justice. Old Fred Nietzsche, as it turns out, isn't much of a nihilist either. Remember that in-depth definition I gave you on nihilism earlier? Nihilism.
Which can be defined as everything is meaningless. Imagine summarizing an entire philosophy in 3 words. Well, I just did. I'd be a little worried about nihilists coming for me, except they believe in nothing.
Well, one of Nietzsche's more famous quotes is, "To live is to suffer, to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." That certainly sounds like meaning to me. Both seem to be comfortable exploring deep levels of meaninglessness, but neither of them ever really give in. Now, I don't want to dwell on this point for too long because even Nick Pizzolatto has flat out said Rust-Cohle is not a nihilist. Nick saying, quote, "I think if you watch the show, it's obvious Cohle does not believe in the stuff he says. Anytime somebody called Cohle a nihilist, I was like, what do you think a nihilist is? Because far from nothing meaning anything to Cohle, if anything, the world seemed overwrought with meaning to Cohle. And for a nihilist, he sure does care about doing the right thing and serving justice. When he complains to the sky, who does he think he's complaining to?" So there were always these contradictions in him. And I always thought it was a real bummer that certain faction of people who thought this guy is laying down truth. I was always like, well, if you've ever been in a freshman dorm room, you might hear the same sorts of stuff. End quote. Who does this Nick Pizzolatto guy think he is, some of you might be saying? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Nick Pizzolatto, the birth of Rust-Cohle. Nick Pizzolatto was the creator and writer of True Detective's first season, and ultimately manifested our favorite fictional sad boy, Rust-Cohle, into existence. But Ian, Nick didn't manifest Rust from nothingness, did he? You might be asking. Excellent question, new friend. You're absolutely right. But where did he get his idea for the world's finest detective? Well, fortunately for us, Nick has been pretty open about some of the influences beyond the previously mentioned philosophical ones we've already covered. In fact, there's 2 specific, more modern influences that greatly impacted the development of Rust-Cohle. The first one we're going to cover is Thomas Ligotti and the conspiracy against the human race. In 2010, just 4 years before the initial release of True Detective, the horror writer Thomas Ligotti released a philosophical book titled The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, in which he discusses why consciousness
Should not exist.
and was actually a big boo-boo. Ligotti also discusses his theory that self is an illusion, free will is made up, and is actually just the equivalent to a puppet having an awareness of its strings. How being alive is a nightmare from which we cannot wake. The universe is unwelcoming and indifferent to our existence. Then finally tackling everyone's favorite topic of antinatalism and providing us with a sales pitch for non-existence. Some of that sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Let's play a little game. Can you guess which of these were said by Thomas Ligotti and which were said by Rust-Cohle? We'll start with an easy one. Cue the Jeopardy music. Ba, 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 ba. All right, and the answers are... Wow, great work, but the warm-up round is now over. No cheating on these next ones, or you'll need to report to the principal's office for potential denial of programming and weekend suspension. Cue the Jeopardy music again. Boom, boom. If you got all those correct, congratulations! You win nothing and life is still hopeless. Thomas Ligotti was born in 1953, and at the time of this video is still alive today. In his philosophical nonfiction novel, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, he dives into pessimism, antinatalism, and a little nihilism. Ligotti offers up the perspective that aliveness ain't so good, and the more that a person becomes consciously aware of how meaningless, and as he calls it, malignantly useless everything is, the worse it gets. Ligotti claims that if each person truly understood these things, they'd be down for species-wide extinction, and he does a pretty good job of presenting his Dark Times of Ridgemont High case. But even with this strong case, there's something worth noting. Thomas Ligotti has what's known as anhedonia, which can have an incredible effect on motivation and, more importantly, reduce and in some cases eliminate the ability to experience pleasure. This is worth noting because I would imagine a person who is unable to experience pleasure is likely going to have a pretty grim outlook on life. Fortunately for us, Ligotti's motivation was strong enough to provide us with some pretty sweet horror stories, poems, and a philosophical endeavor. And if you're a fan of Rustcohle, which I'd imagine you are if you made it through the video this far, I'd recommend you absolutely check out some of his work. But knowing about Thomas Ligotti's case of anhedonia adds an additional layer to how he might have come to the conclusion that everything is malignantly useless. You know, similar to how Russ's synesthesia might have a small effect on how he experiences the world. It's always worth considering someone's internal chemistry and how it affects their philosophy. A few years ago, I discovered Ligotti's work while cruising around the internet looking for more Rustcohle after yet another rewatch of True Detective Season 1. During that time, I'd also seen some articles about Nick Pizzolatto using Thomas Ligotti's work to plagiarize Rust's character, and while the similarities are undeniable, here's what I'll say about that. While Rust's character is clearly influenced and in some moments nearly identical to Thomas Ligotti's conspiracy against the human race, Rust would not exist without the entirety of the story that surrounds him. Though some lines of dialogue match closely and the belief systems are similar, there are clearly other influences on his character's development, many of which we've covered in this video. So any criticism regarding Pizzolatto's usage of Ligotti's work being a ripoff or plagiarized is unfounded. Anecdotally, I'm grateful to True Detective for introducing me to Thomas Ligotti because there's a low chance I would have discovered him otherwise. You know who else I wouldn't have discovered if it hadn't been for my endless curiosity regarding Rustcohle? Another contributor to Casa della Rustcohle philosophy, a professor, writer, and cosmic pessimist who goes by the name Eugene Thacker and wrote the book titled In the Dust of This Planet. Now this guy was a curveball. I'd known about Thomas Ligotti for a long time, but it wasn't until I randomly stumbled upon this podcast while working on this video that I discovered Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet. Unbeknownst to me, in a 2014 Wall Street Journal article, Nick Pizzolatto actually mentions Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, along with mentioning Ligotti in the same article, stating in the interview that Thacker's book released in 2011 had a very direct influence on Rust's overall worldview. In the Dust of This Planet dives into what Thacker calls philosophical horror, referencing H.P. Lovecraft and the legendary John Carpenter. He discusses what he calls the unthinkable world and how horror reveals the limits of human understanding. Things like monsters, black holes, voids, and plagues provide insight to things that can't be fully grasped. He also covers things like dark mysticism, cosmic pessimism, and a dash of eroticism and the occult. So yeah, Eugene Thacker is basically like Rustcohle's cousin. What's really cool is Eugene Thacker is still very much alive and cranking out new material. I really like his point of view on what he likes to call horror philosophy and cosmic pessimism. He also talks a lot about black metal, which I think is pretty sweet. If this is the first time you're hearing about Thomas Ligotti or Eugene Thacker, I'd highly recommend checking out both of them. They both offer some pretty bleak philosophies about the world, most of which are shared by Rustcohle. So if you're looking for a little more Rust, it's a great place to do some exploring. But wait, something happens to Rustcohle near the end of the season. Their shared philosophies seem to part ways just before the conclusion. Now, I know it was a few days ago, but hopefully you remember earlier when we discussed how Nietzsche fit in with Rustcohle on the whole time is a flat circle thing. And if you recall, we covered Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence using the character Zarathustra from his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Well, there was one tiny detail about Zarathustra's story I neglected to mention. In the story, Zarathustra spends some time questing around, but during his travels he avoids his darkest thoughts. At some point, Zarathustra is confronted by the horrifying realization that if time is infinite, then life endlessly repeats itself. What is he to do after all those years of searching for some reprieve, only to discover the search might never end? Well, the outcome of Zarathustra's quest turns out to be as simple as living a life that's worth living, so that when it is repeated, it is worth living again and again
And again.
If life is like Groundhog Day, give it purpose, something to make it worth a damn. A Upon this realization, Zarathustra's fear is removed and replaced with hope. So when Rust barely survives, he has a moment in which he feels his daughter's unconditional love. This moment gives Rust a feeling of hope, because before, Rust believed that
The world needs bad men. We keep the other bad men from the door.
the good in this world is thinning by the day, with the bad overtaking quickly. But after this experience of his, something changes for Rust. It doesn't shift his perspective away from being.
In philosophical terms, I'm what's called a pessimist.
He still believes the bad outweighs the good, but what it does do is shift him away from believing the bad is winning. Rust feels hope that maybe there's enough good to make the next cycle through, the next pass around the flat circle, worth living for. And just like Buddha finding enlightenment through the suffering, or Sisyphus finding purpose in pushing the rock, or even Ouroboros eating his own tail for eternity, Rust finds purpose and that he no longer believes that the world is only dark, because God might still be dead.
Once there is only dark. Yes, any lights win it.
Thank you so much for watching. This was my favorite deep dive to do so far. If you enjoyed watching the video, please let me know by hitting the like button, and make sure to subscribe for more videos I'll do in the future. Rust is a man full of contradictions and paradoxes, like many of us are. Throughout the season, saying outrageous things like,
I don't think that man can love.
even though he'd absolutely loved his daughter when she was alive, and was reminded once again of that love after his near-death experience. But I think those characteristics are what attracted so many people to Rust and Cohle in the first place. I honestly went into making this planning to dismantle the stereotype that Rust is a philosophical pessimist, and was surprised to discover that that was the only one of his philosophies that seemingly stayed true to the end. But worse yet, now I'm wondering if I'm a philosophical pessimist. What do you think? Are you a pessimist now? Or are you one of those silly glass half full types? Let me know in a comment down below. Please consider giving Season 1 of True Detective a rewatch, and maybe crack open one of Eugene Thacker, Thomas Ligotti, or Arthur Schopenhauer's books for a little read. And if you're feeling exceptionally dangerous, why not do a little dabbling in some of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche's works? In the meantime, this is Ian, signing off. Climax.